that Mr. Kuttner brought up was this idea of personality being able to solve the problems that we've seen now. And Obama, of course, is a very personality-based presidency, especially in its rise. If that's not the answer, if sort of one unifier isn't the answer, what do you guys think is?
You guys want me? Do you want me to stand or sit?
Here.
So we pass this?
Yeah.
Pass the lapel mic. Well, I'm saying there's deep structural forces at work here, and that it isn't just personality. On the other hand, the more I study history, the more I believe that even though structural forces are very powerful, that the presence or absence of leadership matters immensely. I mean, we were not guaranteed to get somebody with the self-confidence and the optimism of Roosevelt, and the nerve, the gutsiness of Roosevelt. And you know, if you look at what was going on in civil rights politics in September and October of 1963, before President Kennedy was assassinated, the Kennedy brothers had just about concluded that this wasn't doable. And it took Lyndon Johnson, as a Southerner who knew how to work Congress, to decide that his legacy was going to be a civil rights revolution. So there is a certain amount of randomness, there's a certain amount of idiosyncratic event in history, but I think because of the enormous structural shift in American capitalism in the last 30 years, it would have taken somebody quite extraordinary. And Obama was merely very good. And that wasn't enough. Hasn't been enough so far.
I'm the last guy in the world to be offering advice to national policymakers, given my track record. And I thought Bob's exposition of all this was brilliant. But as a guy who, as a result of my own experience, tries to teach future public servants around here how you bring people together and develop consensus in a kind of reasonable way, which I try to do, I gotta tell you, had I been there, I would have been surprised at the difficulty this guy, who is, I think, a guy with extraordinary skill at developing consensus, generally, has had in trying to do that. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of us have misgauged the hardness as well as the economic power of the opposition. But as a guy who, at this point in time, says, okay, so what do you do now if you happen to be the President of the United States? And by the way, the congressional Democrats have been out to lunch on this as well. This is not just a one-man band. I'm not hearing anything from them these days. My view, if I were advising the President at this moment in time, would be essentially to say, it's clear your opponents are not prepared to sit down and achieve consensus. They're just not into it. I don't think you can do much with them in the context of the Congress. At least you get over this debt limit thing. And so my advice politically and otherwise to the President and to the congressional Democrats would be to simply stake out now a tough, and if you'll pardon the expression, progressive position. And I don't mean that so much in an ideological sense as in simply pointing out repeatedly, and by the way, the events of the last month or two, as Kuttner pointed out the other day, certainly have demonstrated that cutbacks don't revive an economy. Because if they did, and by the way, tax cuts as well, given what happened under Bush, we'd have 2% unemployment if tax cuts did this. And essentially take on the opposition and take on whoever is going to oppose him for the presidency, because they're all singing the same tune, only it gets worse and worse. And I said to somebody the other day, Romney's a fraud and Perry's a nut. And I don't know them personally that well, but I do think Bob's correct in this sense. I don't fault the president for trying to achieve consensus, because I would have tried to do the same thing on the assumption that the people I'm dealing with are quite reasonable. But when you discover that they're not, and by the way, it's our own damn fault that 87 right-wing screwballs got elected to the Congress. Where were all of us while these guys were getting themselves elected? I think at this point now, it's not that we're going to have a wonderfully constructive next, year, but I think at this point, from a political standpoint, as well as from the standpoint of educating the public, both the president and the congressional Democrats have got to stand up, speak out, tell folks what's going on, and take very, very tough positions. Now, having said that, as Bob pointed out, the Kennedys were not tough on civil rights. It was Lyndon Johnson who did that. Franklin Roosevelt campaigned for a balanced budget in 1932, and it wasn't until he had a conversation with John Maynard Keynes that he changed his mind. So there's no perfection here, folks, as any of us know who've been in elective office. It's a tough business. But if I were Obama at this point, and a congressional Democrat, or a congressional Democrat, I think I've seen enough to tell me that consensus building and conciliation with this crowd is just not possible. And so what you really have to do now is engage in a very tough political exercise between now and next November, in which you use the obvious facts, which is that austerity doesn't revive an economy, lay out a program, bang away at it, take the issue to the other side, and see if you can get yourself reelected.
Why don't you use this one?
Oh, okay, how's that? It's got a little less feedback, I think. Well, I don't know that I have a lot to add, but I certainly agree with Mike that Obama has got to get his message out. He has to have a story of what he's trying to do, and couple that with there are other places to affect policy change in the government without having to get a statute passed. I mean, there are executive orders, there are agencies that can do things. There are, in the Bush administration, there was a lot going on in the financial regulatory agencies that were simply telling the states they couldn't do things. There was a whole scenario where the state banking commissioners were trying to get control over these fraudulent loans, and the comptroller of the currency just issued a regulation and said you can't do that. The Supreme Law, we're the Supreme Law of the land, and you're not entitled to this. The National Banking Act is Supreme Law of the land, and you can't do that, and that's it. And the banking commissioners sued, and they went up to the Supreme Court, and they won, but it was too late. So I think that he has to really think about guerrilla warfare here and get his message out. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why he didn't take on the Elizabeth Warren appointment. He was going to lose, but take it on and say, this is why I'm doing it. I'm doing it to protect consumers, to protect the middle class. This is my message, and these people who are trying to defeat her are doing it not for you, by the way, voters out there. It's to protect the banks. And so he needs to use his bully pulpit, which nobody's got a better one, and to use all the other powers that are within the executive branch to make some good things happen for people while, with any luck, the voters will wake up and we'll get a few more progressive, I'm happy to use that word, progressive people back in government.
Great. Thank you. Question? Over here.
Thank you very much. My question is, compared to American government, what's your view about Chinese government, which was more efficient?
Which is more, I didn't get the last
Efficient.
word. Oh, efficient.
Efficient, yeah.
Oh, this is actually one of my favorite topics. Efficient and effective are the two E words that we really need to talk about. And so in my world of the insurance commissioner's world, there's always been a lot of complaining about the fact that insurance, which is one of the biggest financial industries in the country, if not the biggest actually, is regulated at the state level, and it is very inefficient. It is also very effective. That is the only financial services industry that did not collapse in 2008, and the insurance commissioners were all over the AIG problem, that the federal government wanted to reach down into the insurance companies and get their assets in order to save AIG, and the state insurance commissioner said, no way is that gonna happen on our watch. So it's not particularly efficient, but it's effective. So I think it's very important to keep your eye on, well, what is it that we are trying to accomplish here? And are you getting there by our form of government? Our form of government is very messy. But until recently, I think it has been pretty effective. The efficiency of the financial markets, everybody was, until the fall of sort of really actually 2006 and 7, people knew that there were really big problems. But until Bear Stearns imploded, everybody thought that these markets were efficient, but I think we all discovered that they weren't effective.
Quickly. Well, for me, one of the really interesting things about China is that compared to Western finance, China has a very rudimentary banking system. The banks take in deposits and they make loans, and China grows at 11% a year. Whereas our system, banks do all kinds of Byzantine, complicated things that they don't even understand, and they take 41% of the profits of the entire economy, and they crash the economy. So I think there's something to be said for a more rudimentary banking system that doesn't securitize this and have CDS on top of that. Now the manufacturing part of the Chinese system, I think, is a whole other story. Again, Western economic theory doesn't know what to do with the Chinese system, because according to standard laissez-faire theory, China could not possibly be succeeding because the state plays too direct a role. And yet Chinese industry is doing very well because the state does play a role. I think the tricky question is whether the relationship between China and the United States is healthy, where so much of our industry is moving to China, and then China is providing so much of our capital. And this can go on for some time, but only with the result that China becomes more and more of a manufacturing power, and the United States becomes more and more of a debtor, which in the long run is probably not good for either country. So I think that relationship needs to be redefined.
Just a couple of quick points. First, to follow up on what Nani said. At the state level, banking regulation worked too. We have 145 state-regulated banks in Massachusetts. These are the so-called community banks. Generally have a main office in one of our regional cities, and maybe 7 or 8 or 9 branches. They're very active in their communities. They do a lot of lending. They do a lot of interesting stuff. In those places, banking is boring the way it used to be.
It's supposed to.
And safe. Not a single one of those banks, with one possible exception, got into trouble. And the Butler Bank in Lowell got into trouble because it was badly managed. And as we do in this state, as Nani will tell you, within a matter of days, the state banking commissioner moved in there and took it over and ousted the management, as Bob described. And that was happening in states all over the country with state-regulated banking institutions. But subprime mortgages, we don't allow. They're against the rules. You can't do that. And that's another success story like the insurance regulators. Now, what about China? Well, it's an interesting place, and it's going to get more interesting. I'm a big train guy, as all of you know, and I was marveling at the Chinese high-speed trains until one of them ran into another one, killed 32 people. And there's a corruption scandal now, and so on. I'm not finding fault. We've got corruption too. We have private companies that mess up all the time.
We don't have fast trains.
And we don't have fast trains. Kitty and I just came back from a week in Korea, where I served for 16 months in the middle 50s, at a time when Korea was a third world country with an annual per capita income of $50. Today, it's a modern, progressive economy and society with one of the best transit systems I've ever ridden, with high-speed rail, with universal health care. They've all done it in 54 years. So, you come back to the United States, folks, it's a little embarrassing. Not only that, they have a right-of-center president who's all about green jobs and green industry. Can you believe it? That's his priority. They're not debating climate change. They're taking economic advantage of it. Well, some scattered thoughts, but in any event, I think our relationship with China is going to be an interesting one. I don't know what this paranoia is about China. They might, in fact, create one carrier group in the South China Sea. We got 11. Don't ask me what they're doing out there. It's got nothing to do with terrorism. Not going to stop the terrorists with a carrier group. Can we agree? But I'm intrigued. I hope we will develop good, ongoing relationships with China. As Bob said, everything we use around here, we buy from China. Everything we borrow from China. So I don't know what we're worried about, except for the issues that he raises. But I hope we're not going to start developing Cold War paranoia about China. Best I've seen over the past few years, they're not invading other countries either. The way we invaded Iraq, they seem to be minding their own business. Doing a pretty good job of it.
Over here. You have a question?
Yeah.
Come to the mic.
I have a question regarding what makes the Tea Party people so passionate? What is the philosophical foundation of their movement? In other words, where is it written that low taxes are better than little more taxes?
Well, they're starved for sex. That's the problem. That's what That's my
That line will not be duplicated in the rest of the semester.
But I have it on tape.
I think when political progressives drop the ball, economic angst migrates to the right. And if you are somebody who is middle class, lower middle class, and you ask yourself, what have I gotten back from the government lately, and you don't happen to be retired and getting Social Security and Medicare, and you don't have a kind of a sophisticated analysis of why laissez-faire is bad medicine, you're very likely to conclude not very much. And you're very likely to conclude correctly that Washington and Wall Street are two sides of the same coin. And there's been a lot of downward mobility in this country in the past 30 or 40 years. And I think when political progressives drop the ball, which has been the case, I mean, the Democratic Party has become a very centrist party, then that anger gets articulated by the right. there were a lot of right-wing crazies in the 1930s. And although they got some traction, once Huey Long was assassinated and out of the picture, and I'm not proposing this but from about 35 on, every time the right tried to organize working people, they ran into scads of people who loved Roosevelt. And that's the best antidote for the far right making hay from an economic crisis. And we don't have that right now. Now, I'm not going to, I don't know why a particular person in a particular place decides to, become an activist. But I know that there's not a whole heck of a lot going on our side. And I think expectations were so high in 08, and they're so damped down right now, that it's very hard to get something going. And that's just deplorable, because what we need more than anything else is a movement on our side.
I mean, what produced Hitler? The collapse of the Weimar Republic and the German economy. Wasn't that what happened? I think. So I think Bob's absolutely correct. I mean, this is a historic phenomenon. And we shouldn't be surprised about it, but as he says, it seems to me there are things you can do about it. And sometimes it's a Roosevelt, sometimes it's more than that. But we shouldn't be surprised at the fact that people of moderate income are angry, and they're going to take it out of the folks that are in office. Simple as that. It's the economy, stupid, right? Isn't that what we heard in 1992? That was right.
I can't top Mike's comment, I don't think, but I do think that there's another phenomenon going on here that we shouldn't mistake here. This is not just a populist movement. This is being funded in addition by some very, very wealthy people who do not want government to succeed. And the fact that the Koch brothers are paying for the buses to go to Washington is something that I think a lot of people who are on those buses don't even know. So that, I don't know how you get that message out, but I think the people on the buses are responding to a genuine fury about government not helping them, but it's being funded by people who don't want government to help them.
That's right. Exactly. Well said.
Question all the way up here on the back.
Oh, thank you.
Who are you? If you just can you tell us who you are?
Bill Sisk. I just graduated in the spring from the master's program in political science, and I had some questions about. First of all, I get a sense that each of you have sort of varying levels of cynicism about the Obama administration at this point. I mean, it seems like, so let's say he wins the upcoming elections. What do you think? Does that mean a sunny outlook, or any possible change? Like, will we get bank regulation? Will we get? Will they at least be able to change the agenda from the deficit to job creation? Will any of these things happen, or are we just sort of hoping for the lesser of two evils at this point?
That's a great question, and I'll take a first crack at it. But one of the reasons I think that Obama has not taken on the banks is because we actually need campaign finance reform. He needs those people to get reelected. And if he's not running for office again, if he gets a second term, then maybe he won't need to be as deferential to them. The second point is, I think he can't do this by himself. I mean, there's no question in my mind, I'm voting for the guy. He's better than, he's the only one who comes close to even being in my political sort of neighborhood. But I think he can't do it by himself. And I would say to Bob's point about the fact that he kept all the old boys in there when he came in the economic advisory roles and made Kuttner Treasury Secretary, et cetera, he was facing the worst financial crisis in 50 years. So I have a hard time actually blaming him for that, but I think he might have taken the opportunity to renew those people sooner than he has. But he can't do it by himself. I think the voters have got to get out and get some people to support him and to say we need people who will vote for things that will help create jobs.
I'm not cynical about Obama. I think he's done some terrific things. He's the first president of 4 to give us something close to universal health care. Truman failed, Nixon failed, Clinton failed. He succeeded. Now, still hanging in the balance. As I know, because I signed a universal health care bill, we provided for a 3-year phase-in period. Well, succeeded. Me, everything couldn't screw it up. It took us 20 years to get close to what we thought we had done in 1988. So, but that's a huge achievement. So are a lot of other things that he's done. But it's interesting, you know, when we were coming down to the wire in the 1992 presidential elections, Richard Nixon, of all people, was still alive. And Bush was obviously floundering. And it looked as if he was going to be defeated. And about 2 weeks before the election, some reporter asked Nixon whether, if the economy is in lousy shape, will the incumbent president always lose? And he said, no, but he's got to have a plan. That was one of the more perceptive things that Richard Nixon ever said. I mean it. No, he won't necessarily lose, but he's got to have a plan. And right now, I don't think the American people have a sense that the administration or its Democratic allies in the Congress have a plan. And I'm concerned that whatever we hear tomorrow is going to be largely warmed over cheese. And that's my concern. So it seems to me Obama has to have a plan, and he and the vice president, who can be very effective at this, preferably on the same platform together, have got to go out 6 days out of 7 from now until November of 2012, advocating the plan, explaining the plan, taking on the opposition, and making the case for something other than the kind of stuff we're going to get from the other side. That may or may not be successful, but if he doesn't do that, then I think his chances of re-election are not good.
Well, you asked whether we were cynical about Obama and what we would hope for if he was reelected. I think the best case scenario that I can construct is that he follows Michael Dukakis' advice. I wrote a piece last year called "Give Him Hell, Barry," saying that Obama should do what Truman did in '48 and send up a lot of legislation that he knows the Republicans are going to vote against, so that he can clarify what he's for and what they're against. And fortuitously, the guy who is most likely to win the nomination is a nutcase. I mean, the more you smoke out Perry, the more you realize that he is so far to the right of what most Americans want that he's the kind of opponent you would dream of, except that you've got to be more effective than Obama has been. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that a hanging concentrates the mind, and that a near-death experience of, sinking in the polls as the unemployment numbers keep getting worse, leads him to take our advice. And unlike Michael, I've never lost an election. So it would require him to be reelected with coattails. Right now he's got anti-coattails. I don't know what the expression is. We'd have to take back the House, and the arithmetic is so terrible in the Senate. It's a 53-47 margin with 11 Republican seats and 23 Democratic seats up. And this is the class of '06, which was the high watermark class of Democrats who got elected in states where Democrats aren't supposed to get elected. So it will take a small miracle for the Democrats to hold the Senate, even though they've got a 3-seat or a 6-seat, depending on how you count margin. So if all that happens, there is still the problem that this is a great deflation. And the undertow pulling down the economy is such that it's going to take much stronger medicine than anything that's being proposed in mainstream politics right now. I mean, it took World War II to pull us out of the Great Depression. And in World War II, the annual deficits fluctuated between 25 and 29% of GDP. That's what it took to get us out of the Depression. And in 1945, the debt to GDP ratio was double what it is today, but we had 25 years of shared prosperity. So somebody has to go back and read that history and decide that you need not just $100 billion or $300 billion, but you need a truly massive public infrastructure program. You need to completely reverse the conventional wisdom on austerity. You need to get finance back in the role of servant rather than master of the rest of the economy, and then maybe we can get a recovery going. If he loses, the only good news is that it all falls in on them, and if there's still an election in 2016, the Democrats might come back and win it. But that's, we've seen that movie, and that's not a very happy movie.
Other question? Back here. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you. Richard Giordano. I haven't been to these lectures before. Fascinating. I'm wondering if you could expand, or the three of you could expand on we're talking about the role of government, but I'm also wondering if we can talk about who's trying to take over government, and sort of, you hinted at the Koch brothers, the Koch brothers, and it seems to me that part of what we need to talk about tonight is the class struggle over government, and the fact that the Koch brothers are trying to run the government, to look at Alito and the Supreme Court and what's happening with the EPA or banking regulations. So I'm just wondering if we can frame some of this as who's trying to control government and not tell us what the story is.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I did mention the Koch brothers. I think that this is a part of what, there's a fellow named Simon Johnson who's writes a lot about the economy, and he's a former chief economist for the IMF, and he refers to the Wall Street bankers as the oligarchs. And they have been since, well, at least for 30 years, working on this whole effort to deregulate the financial structure so that they can run these corporations that make them lots and lots and lots of money. And the differential, the income inequality is huge. And I think Bob was mentioning the sort of other infrastructure institutions that have been devalued along with this. The unions in particular they have been demonized as being sort of anti-democratic, but in fact they really built the middle class and they protected people in the middle class. And as a partner to management, I'm not talking about public unions right now, I'm talking about unions in the private sector, can be a very positive function of government, sort of beside government, not besides, but along with government. And I think the financial oligarchs have been very successful in redefining the message, and that progressives need to be brave. Why are we always apologizing for being progressives? We should say what we care about and go out and fight for it, and we don't really do that, and it will take a long time. It's not going to happen in the next election. And there's a lot of money at stake, but there are rich progressives too who care about this, and we need to engage all of them in helping take back the message, I think.
Well, you use an interesting term. You use the term class struggle. And I remember as a graduate student a very long time ago, dabbling in Marx and reading Marx and kind of deciding, that's not for me. I'm a liberal. I'm not a Marxist. The world was a more Galbraithian world back then. I don't think I've become any more Marxian. I think the world has become more Marxian. I think Nani's right that financial oligarchs have an astronomical amount of power. And the comment that Nani made before about the pressure that Obama was under in a crisis to appoint the old guard as a way of reassuring financial markets. You know, we would have been so much better off if he had appointed Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman or Sheila Bair, people who wanted to break with the oligarchs, because it could have been much worse than it was in the fall of '08, and all that these people delivered was a protracted crisis rather than a crisis that would have been gotten through by dethroning them. I mean, if you know, we can shut down a state bank and bring in new management, as Michael was mentioning, we can change the management at Citigroup. But the idea of changing the management at Citigroup, oh my God, it's Citigroup. Better to put, what was it? It was $45 billion of taxpayer money and another, I think it was $322 billion of Federal Reserve guarantees so that these clowns can keep their jobs and their bonuses. So if that's not an oligarchy, I don't know what is. And I can also answer the question of why he didn't appoint Elizabeth Warren to the Consumer Commission. 2 reasons. First of all, she was a radical in the best sense of the word, and she had her own constituency. And a president who appoints someone who has her own constituency appoints someone who's very difficult to fire. Secondly, she had spent 2 years as chairman of the Congressional Oversight Panel, chairwoman of the Congressional, raking Tim Geithner over the coals. What do you think Tim Geithner was whispering in the president's ear about whether he should appoint Elizabeth Warren? And the fact that Tim Geithner is who he listens to is just testament to the power of this oligarchy.
Again, consider the source, but there is a communication problem here as well. I haven't had a chance to meet and talk with Elizabeth Warren, but I expect that's going to happen next week or so. And one of the things I'm going to say to her is, if you're running against Scott Brown, your message has got to be a vote for Brown is a vote to turn the federal government over to Boehner, McConnell, and Karl Rove. That's your message. Is that unfair? I don't think so.
No, of course not.
But I'm not hearing that from Democrats. In fact, if I were running for the Senate in any state of the country, that would be my message. You vote for this guy or this woman, you're turning the government over to Boehner, McConnell, and Rove. You know, Martin, Barton, and Fish. For those of us old enough to remember that. Right? Sound pretty good. I think we've badly handled the healthcare issue. The overwhelming majority of Americans should be for this. They're not. Why not? Haven't communicated effectively. The overwhelming majority of people without health insurance in this country are working or members of working families. If you're on welfare, you get Medicaid. This is all about whether working people in the United States and their families will have decent, affordable health care. If you went out and took a poll tomorrow and asked the American people, should working people and their families have decent, affordable health care, what do you think the numbers would look like? 95 yes and 5 haven't thought about it. Seriously. Have you heard that? No, it's about pre-existing conditions and insurance reform and individual mandates and so on and so forth. Now, I understand what the opposition is trying to do. But the clear, unequivocal message coming from the administration and the congressional Democrats, in my opinion, should have been this is about making sure that working people and families in the United States have decent, affordable health care. Have you heard that from anybody? I don't think so. Does anybody know the overwhelming majority of people without insurance are working members of working families? I don't think so. Most Americans think it's another welfare program. We're taking it from them to give it to those folks, right? So how you frame these issues and how you communicate, as only one knows who didn't do a very good job of it, I'm sorry to say, in 1988, means a lot. And that's an essential part of this political battle, folks. No question about it. So far, I think the Democrats have been doing a lousy job of that.
Is this guy a national treasure or what?
Indeed, we have many national treasures here today, but Mike particularly. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's 8 o'clock. I want to thank all of you for coming here. Let me just close with one or two remarks. We spent a lot of time tonight talking about politics. We spent a lot of time talking about Mr. Obama. We started talking about the Tea Party. But if you parse that out a little bit, it's really beyond the politics, all about the question of what is the role of government, what is the role of markets. That's what this is all about. And indeed, that's an age-old conversation. And that is precisely the conversation we're going to have here every Wednesday night through December 14th. What is the role of government? What is the role of the market? How can we build a relationship between the market and government which serves all people rather than a small oligarch? And so I'm hopeful as we go along and you see the marvelous array of additional speakers we have, that by the end of this semester we'll have a much better, much keener understanding of what these issues are about, particularly as we go into the full-scale, kind of election year issues that we're going to see next year. The thing that I think you heard from all of our speakers tonight, and one that I'd like to reemphasize, and it's the one that I've been most frustrated by, some of you may have seen my piece in the New York Times this morning, is that my wife and I worked very hard for Obama. We spent more time, more money than we've had on all the other campaigns combined, including the time I worked for this governor. And what I've been frustrated by is precisely what they ended on. The lack of education, the lack of having, the absence of a president who can speak the truth to the American people and say, this is what's going on, folks. Mike was at least paraphrasing Franklin Delano Roosevelt the other day, as were several other friends, thinking about the days of the fireside chats, where you tuned in your AM radio and you heard the president very calmly telling why he was doing the most radical things that had ever happened in American politics, and getting people to understand why he was doing it, and in the course of it, taking on some brutal enemies, every bit as brutal as the enemies that Mr. Obama faces, and Huey Long and Father Coughlin and others. And he did it by constantly educating, constantly building a message, bringing that message out back and forth over and over again. And what I don't understand, given the spectacular campaign that Barack Obama waged in 2008, that he hasn't been able to do the same thing now as president and explain to people, this is why we have to do this. This is why we have to spend more money. This is why what we have to do in the housing market. This is why we did, as Mike was saying, what we had to do on health care. And that is what's been missing. Tune in tomorrow night. Watch carefully, not only the words, but the passion, the emotion, what you hear tomorrow night. I happen to believe that tomorrow night may be the most important evening in Barack Obama's first term. How he handles that, unfortunately, I have a fear of what I think will happen. But it will be very interesting to see whether, in fact, he's listened indirectly to what these three wonderful people have told us. I want to thank Bob Kuttner for joining us. We've really had a wonderful treat in having him. Of course, my colleagues, Johnny Burns and Mike Dukakis. See you here next Wednesday night when we take a look at how Hollywood looks at government. through film clips going all the way back to the early part of last century.